All right, welcome back, Science 7. Today we are doing second part of the Unit B plant review, which is composed of Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. Note the fact that when it comes to first two chapters of the Unit B plays such a huge role, especially like structure and adaptation to a little bit of a human impact part, the mechanism of the transportation, all of those are in first half. The last half talk more about human impact and soil and some of those technique that we use, hydroponic, crop rotation, those kind of ones are the one that we're going to focus. Like yesterday or last class, I want you to prepare some kind of notebook for your own review that answers several questions that I put it over here, or a series of word cards using index cards, like question at the front, answer at the back, those kind of thing, or word at the front, terminology at the front, at the back, definition, example, drawing, those kind of thing. The document does not have answers for following questions or checklists. Even if there's a question, it is some kind of checklist question so that if you can answer that, you're on the right track. I want you to highly recommend using PowerPoint slides that I use, class notes, and textbook. Let's start with chapter 3, folks. As you may notice, we start everything by doing soil. So, what is organic matter? So, don't just put definition of organic matter. Think about what kind of chemical. When it comes to that, I can answer a little bit. The one that has carbon in it. And it's dead matters. We need decomposers, right? What are minerals? Minerals are some of those metal ions like potassium, magnesium, those kind of guys. Sodium a little bit too. And what kind of mechanism are they using? And since they're in the soil, is that shoot system, root system that play a huge role? You need to answer those. There are 5 factors that determine how soils develop. We learned about this a little bit. It does depends on abiotic factor around it. Is that rock, soil, clay, depends on those. If rock undergoes erosion a lot, and if it's coast area, we have sandy soil, something like that. Climate does play a huge role, and when it comes to climate, adaptation of the plant is very significant, like flat stem for cactus or vertical deep fibrous root for cactus, those kind of thing. Vegetation, it's basically determine the amount of organic matter. You may notice that that matter having soil is known as humus. So those are the good example. Some of the landscape, if you have a lot of plants condensed and have a lot of roots, that means they generally prevent erosion because the soil hold up the sand, rock, whatever the surrounding soil. And developing soil take a long period of time. So those are the 5 factors. Please look at textbook for any more details. What helps soil more nutritious? Nutritious soil have to have many different type of chemical, and they are generally done by decomposer, because decomposer, you need to find out its role, which is recycling dead organic matters. And the example of those guys are bacteria, fungus, earthworms. Those are the decomposers example. We also learn about so many different types of soil. And when it comes to these, I want you to understand and this is good idea to write down and find out the answer. Properties of those soil, definitions, and more importantly, examples of those soil and how they're different. So we learn about saline soil, like for example, the one that is a little alkaline, the one that has a lot of sodium chloride, loam soil, sandy soil, peaty soil, silty soil, and clay soil. Some of the important part of the property, let's say, what is the soil that has the smallest pore? That's a clay soil, something like that. The next part, we talk about several human efforts to improve the quality of the soils, and it is related directly to agricultural businesses and industries. We learn about two different type of fertilizers, one that talk about organic fertilizers and chemical fertilizers. We also did quite a lot of debate about those too. Like organic is expensive, but it's very, very eco-friendly because it is recyclable organic matter like from feces and any type of dead dry matter like residue of the grass after you mow the grass, those kind of things too. When it comes to chemicals, they're a little bit easy to make and they're cheaper, but at the same time, those are quite dangerous in terms of chemicals. Both of them have nitrogen in it, but chemical fertilizer have additional chemicals that actually can make water acidic, give problem to watershed system. Remember the guest speaker, and those kind of side problems that occur. I want you to think about a bunch of pros and cons about these choices in addition to definition, example, and those kind of other aspects because it does play a huge role. And also, what are the three main chemical? Like I mentioned, one of them I mentioned about nitrogen. You can find it from my PowerPoint booklet, but more importantly, if you really want to know the detail of these three, I highly recommend go to textbook section. Irrigation technique, those are the one that you provided water, like fountain kind of water, the water that go around, and then those are the field. Those are something that you may want to review. And clearing land, those are the one where using a bulldozer we clear the whole thing, and the reason we do that is so that we don't have a lot of weeds and so on, which also cause a lot of problem too. So there are several parts, ladies and gentlemen. Please answer those, like three main chemicals of fertilizer you can use, cue card, and at the back you put those, something like that. Can we grow plants without soil? Yes, we can. I want you to review hydroponic technique. This is the one where we don't have soil, but you have nutritious solution in it. And those are lab grown plants too. So what kind of abiotic condition is required? Some kind of pH, is this should be neutral or acidic basic? The answer is neutral. You generally want to have neutral environment. But I want you to look at those PowerPoint and I want you to look at those textbook section about it to answer these questions. How can we utilize soils better? Um, in textbook, even though I didn't go through as detail about this, there's something called monoculture. We talk about this as example, but monoculture is not the best way of doing it because like the word it says mono, that's a fancy way of saying, for example, if you're a farmer, you're planting only one type of crop. Like if it's corn, the next year will be corn again. Another year it will be corn again, those kind of things. The reason it's not the best practice is because some of those crops use the same type of nutrients. So unless you recycle some of those nutrition in the soil, then then that's a way that you can, how can I say, continue this monoculture. But we learn about crop rotation. That means some year you do barley, some year you do canola, some year you do alfalfa. Those kind of different type of rotation depends on season or depends on the year. And the question that I will ask you is how can we use crop rotation? What are the examples of using the crop rotation? And this part I want you to go to the PowerPoint specifically since I gave you quite a lot of example. And we're going to go to chapter 4. Chapter 3 and chapter 4, like I mentioned, it is relatively a short chapter compared to the first two, so the video won't be that long. The first part of the chapter 4 that plays such a huge role is about what is yield. So definition of yields you need to know. And some of the example of what's a human effort to increase yields, you also need to know too. How can we, oh, I'm repeating myself, increase yields? First thing first, yields is we're focusing on effectiveness and how much useful parts of the crops and plants we can have. That is yields. Of course, you want to research a little bit more using textbook or my lesson booklet, PowerPoints. I want you to go there and then actually look through some definition. We can modify environments in order to increase the yields. Like, for example, we can implement greenhouses to maximally use the number of crops or plants that can grow inside of a smaller area, hydroponic technique. And also another thing about greenhouses, we can control a lot of abiotic factor, right? So know the fact that we can control temperature, water, humidity, if you will, pH level, everything can be controlled regardless of the season. We can harvest something during the winter time too. Hydroponic, we talked about that before in chapter 3, so I'm not going to emphasize a lot, but I want you to look at the example of the yields and what kind of technologies are used for increase the yields. We also learn about a little bit of genetics. And obviously, definition of variation, you need to focus. What is a variation? Well, if I explain very briefly, genetic materials are the key in here because every living matters undergo mutation. Some of the mutation are beneficial, some of them are harmful, but mutation give you variety of trait. Like if it's apple, you don't only have a red apple, you have golden apple, you also have green apple, and when it comes to red apple, you have like Fuji apple, Gaia apple, those kind of crab apple. You have a lot of different type of apples. So variation is variety in genes. You can think it in that way. How can variation give benefit in ecosystem? It does give benefit in ecosystem, ladies and gentlemen, because I'm not going to tell you entire answer. The hint that I can give you is if you have variation, that means you have a beneficial mutation, and then that is good for evolution. But human part, this is playing such a huge role. We don't like to do a lot of variation, but we actually use selective breeding. We talk about this in terms of animals, but most importantly, when it comes to plant, corn is a good example. Ancient corn was not as big and juicy like the one that you see in the grocery store. How do humans use selective breeding technique to increase yield? Why that are connected together? You need to find out. Why do selective breeding practice affect ecosystem? Why not having variety is not good for the ecosystem? You need to also find that out too. Controlling weeds and pests is something that we also emphasize. We call it pesticide for killing up the pests, herbicide for killing up the weeds. And those are the ones that have dangerous chemical, including, we learn about this in first unit and second unit now. What is the chemical DDT do? There are several cons about using DDT, like eggshell thinning. You need to also remember those. Bioaccumulation. As time goes in your body, you have more concentrated of this dangerous chemical. Biomagnification. If you think about the food chain, as you go up to the next level and to the next level, whatever the higher in the top, they have highest concentration in it. So that's the one that DDT does. You can find that out from my booklet and the PowerPoint. We also learn about, even though I mentioned a lot of cons, some pros and cons. What's the benefit? What's disadvantage? There are several ways that you can answer about that too, using pesticide and herbicide. What is the other eco-friendly way? which is something that I mentioned with specific example even, biological control. We are using some kind of natural predator so that predator will eat the pest or predator will eat the weed, something like that. But even in there, we have pros and cons. It's a very expensive project, and then there is so much of way that it may affect non-targeted organism time to time too. Like maybe if you guys remember about cane toad example that I play in the video, please go through that also. And talking about non-targeting, this pesticide and herbicide doesn't only kill the pest, it may actually kill the other animals too, or plants too, depends. So it is something that you may want to go back to answer these questions. What are the pros and cons of biological control? Although I mentioned about this when I talk about in DDT chemical, what is a bioaccumulation? Find out the definition. What is biomagnification? Same thing. What does it mean by harming non-targeting organism? I just said like 10 seconds ago. It's the one that basically kill off the other organism in an ecosystem. What is resistant species? Sometimes, if you guys remember, it does go back to mutation. Um, the pest and weeds, they can undergo mutation too. Once they do the mutation, they develop resistant genes, so the chemical wouldn't kill those offspring. Then in that case, unfortunately, humans need to develop worse chemical to kill them off, right? It's gonna be continuously going. It's the constant, how can I say, battle between resistant species and the dangerous chemical for killing off. How do we have resistant species? By using pesticide and herbicide. I talk about that. The parents don't have a resistant gene. However, when they mate, their offspring may undergo mutation, and that can develop a resistant gene. We also learn about sustainability, which is how can we prevent and conserve more environment surrounding. We learn about two forestry techniques that destroy the ecosystem, including the plants too. This is known as fragmentation and clear cutting. I want you to look it up the definition. What are some techniques that farmers use to discourage the need of chemical? That I put specifically some advice. I've used textbook on chapter 4. You can go there. What is a sustainable environment? I want you to find out the definition about that too. So, long story short, ladies and gentlemen, that is everything. I want you to do the similar review as yesterday. And how can I say? I wish you guys luck for preparing the test that will happen for the next class.